and welcome back for a book haul which is 3 months in the making. These are, I think, close to all of the books that I have acquired in the past 3 months. To be honest, I'm not entirely sure. When you don't film a book haul for that length of time and you need to put things away in places, or you use them or you read them, you do tend to sometimes forget what you've maybe brought into your house. So I've tried to bring them all together, but there's a chance I've missed one or two here or there. I do occasionally share the books I'm buying over on TikTok and Instagram, particularly TikTok, so that's worth bearing in mind if you really want to stay up to date with every single book that I buy. But I've brought a big chunk together here because as the book hoarder I am, I naturally acquired a lot in 3 months, and I think this is going to be quite a long video. But I am really excited to talk about the books I've been buying and acquiring, so it's really nice to just be sitting down and filming a good old-fashioned book haul where I get to do that with you. So without further ado, let's get into the books, shall we? So in no particular order, just starting with the books nearest to me, I actually have 2 books I want to talk about in tandem. The first one is The Once and Future Sex: Going Medieval on Women's Roles in Society by Eleanor Janega. Now, I'm slightly embarrassed to admit that I'm not convinced I read the blurb of this book or read it properly when I bought this book, or even the subtitle, because I got it into my head that this book was a book on sex in medieval times, not women in medieval times, but the act of sex in medieval times and attitudes towards it, etc. And I might have known when I picked the book up what it really was, but between the period of buying it and reading it, I'd forgotten, because I genuinely thought it was about sex in medieval times. And then I picked it up, again, not looking at the subtitle, started reading it and realised it's not. It is literally about going medieval on women's roles in society. It's what it says it is. So I'm embarrassed about that. But it doesn't affect my perception of the book because I've actually read it and really enjoyed it since then. But it does bear mentioning because it pertains to the other book I have in my lap, which is The Fires of Lust: Sex in the Middle Ages by Catherine Harvey, which is a book on sex in medieval times, specifically the Middle Ages. So yeah, I got my book that I thought I bought, but I'm also glad I got this book because this is a fantastic book. Like I said, I've already read it. It's really accessible, I would say, for people who aren't familiar with medieval history. I have been learning a lot more about medieval history, particularly later medieval history, because the medieval era is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not 1,000 years worth of time. I have been really enjoying learning more about medieval history and all of the diversity of that, and I've been dipping my toes in here and there, and this was actually really, like I mentioned, very accessible, very readable, very enjoyable. And although it's not the longest book in the world, I think it really whetted my appetite to learn more about some of the things that are covered in this book that I would like to learn about more in depth. So really enjoyed this. It's also a really beautiful cover, but would recommend. Have not, however, read The Fires of Lust, which I only picked up recently, but when I saw it I was like, it's the book I thought I was buying before. Not literally, but just in content. But I think this should be really interesting. I've always generally been very interested in the history of sex. I've read a lot of books on the history of sex. I spent a lot of time researching and studying specific aspects of the history of sex and antiquity. It's something I enjoy learning about, and I think is a really interesting window into society and people and cultures. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading that one, and they, I'm sure, will make a nice companion set to my education on medieval history. The second book I showed you there, however, was actually part of a book haul from Piccadilly Waterstone, so the Waterstones branch in London, Piccadilly, which is actually the largest bookshop in Europe. If you don't know, it's 9 stories high and it's absolutely massive with loads of different departments. And when I was there, I went on a little bit of a spree with my partner because both of us had actually been saving up our Waterstones points. Waterstones have a loyalty program that you'll probably know about if you're in the UK, where you get stamps on a loyalty card for every £10 you spend in store, or half a stamp if you spend less than that. I probably don't need to explain the system to you, but we've been saving up those stamps for a long time until we both had £50, and it has been so tempting between setting that goal and getting to the point where we had £50 to just spend the 10, the 20, the 30, the 40. But I did it. I managed to make it to 50, as did Chris, and we went on like I said, a little spree. We both spent our £50 in Waterstones Piccadilly together, and it was a ton of fun. So I'll show you the books I picked up on that shopping trip. So besides the medieval history book, I bought 4 other books, 3 of which are fiction and 1 of which is non-fiction. So continuing on with the non-fiction theme, I picked up the transgender issue, An Argument for Justice by Sean Fay, which is a book I've wanted to read for ages. I've heard really fantastic things about it. Even like before it came out, it was getting really good reviews from people I trust in the kind of like political and literary worlds. But the hardback was massive. Do you ever just like pick up a hardback book and just think, what? That is like a weapon, not a book. So I decided to wait until I either got around to picking up the audiobook or the paperback. And then when I saw the paperback, it looked like a normal book. Like, this is a perfectly reasonably sized book. It's like 300 pages. I don't know why the hardback was so big, but this, you know, this is less intimidating. This is easier to carry around, and I am so excited to finally get around to reading it. Like, it is, I am sure, going to be looking a lot at like the current anti-trans rhetoric in politics today, as well as the experiences of trans people and the fight for trans rights. So I think this will be a really educational and informative read. Then I actually picked up a collection of short stories. Now, I haven't picked up a new collection of short stories in quite a long time, but I was chatting about them with my friend Jen, and we were talking about some of like our past favourites and ones we'd enjoyed, and recommending some to each other, and also my partner Chris, and it got me in the mood. And then I saw this on the shelf in Waterstones, which is by an author I've always been keen to read, which is Moira Fowley, and this is her first short story collection, Eyes, Guts, Throat, Bones. Usually, or in the past, I think Moira Fowley predominantly wrote YA novels, usually fantasy with a bit of a creepy undertone, and this is an adult short story collection which I think really like plays on creepy themes. Like, this book was in the horror section, so I'm hoping they're going to be unsettling and creepy and introduce me to a new writer, and maybe reignite my love and excitement of short stories, because I've definitely gone through phases in the past where I've just like consumed them endlessly and then dropped off again. Plus another beautiful cover, which is never a bad thing. Then I have 2 novels, the first of which is a YA novel, and it's also on the creepy side of things. This is like a YA horror thriller, and it's You're Not Supposed to Die Tonight by Kaylin Bayron. So I've actually read 2 Kaylin Bayron books in the past. I've read her Cinderella retelling, and the first in her series inspired by the myth of Medusa from Greek mythology. I particularly loved the one that was inspired by Greek mythology. I think it was fantastic, and I'm really looking forward to reading the sequel. But this just looked like a really fun, quick, creepy, thrilling read that I would probably really like, both because I like Kaylin Bayron's writing, I like the themes that she deals with, and I love me like a fast-paced YA horror thriller. Like, there's nothing quite like the pacing of a YA horror thriller as opposed to an adult one. Love adult ones too, but like when you just need something to completely like capture you like this for a few hours, this is the genre to do it. And this novel in particular sounds like it's going to play with a lot of horror tropes in a really fun way. It's set at a camp, at Camp Mirror Lake, which is like an all-immersive horror experience. So you go there to be frightened, and maybe because you like, I don't know, a murder mystery. I don't know how much of it's about like solving a crime or if it's just about running away, but it's like an all-immersive experience, and our main character is actually one of the actors who plays the final girl who plays the final girl at this camp, but I believe it's going to turn into a little bit more than an all-immersive experience and get a little bit too real. Then lastly, from the Waterstones splurge, we have Patricia Wants to Cuddle by Samantha Allen. This is a book I'd never heard of. Like, I didn't go into it planning on picking it up, and I hadn't heard of the author before, but it was on one of the tables, and I was, you know, grabbed by the cover, thought, what's this about? Then read the blurb and was like, yeah, that's coming home with me. So let me read you the blurb. Renee has made it. She's in the final 4, but is she dying to win? Renee should be thrilled to have been chosen as one of the final 4 contestants in The Catch, the world's biggest reality show. But now that she, the other contestants, and Jeremy, The Catch, have arrived on the remote wooded island for the final show, Renee is starting to wonder if there's something wrong. Is she taking a bigger risk than she'd thought? And as she and the other contestants begin their final challenges, they slowly realise that the island they've been taken to is hiding a terrifying secret. one that could make the final elimination event all too real. So yeah, this one sounds pretty creepy, and I like that it plays on the idea of reality TV in order to do that, so hoping it lives up to my expectations. So the next two books I've picked up here are both gifts from publishers. They were both sent to me for review by publishers, but they are both on similar themes because they're both inspired by Greek and Roman mythology, and both actually were two of my most anticipated releases of the year, so I feel very lucky to have copies. And the first one is Psyche and Eros by Luna McNamara, which is a retelling of the myth of Psyche and Eros, or Psyche and Cupid, from Roman mythology. So I have been so eagerly anticipating this book. As soon as I found out it was coming out, I started following the author on Instagram and Twitter and like checking for updates about this book, because I have never read a retelling of Psyche and Eros before, and it's one of my favourite myths. I think it's such a fascinating myth. It's a myth with a lot of layers that is in some ways a romance, but for me at the core, the like journey of one woman facing challenge after challenge after challenge and overcoming them. So if you don't know, Psyche was Eros's wife, or Cupid's wife. I always feel I want to say Cupid because like the main source we have for this story is a Latin novel. So Psyche and Eros are married. We'll go with the actual names on the title here. But Aphrodite, or Venus, who is Eros or Cupid's mother, is very much against this pairing, and through a series of events she ends up setting Psyche a series of seemingly impossible tasks to complete in order to be reunited with her husband. And I think this is going to be so interesting. And there's also a lot of things that happen in this myth that are very, very reminiscent of tropes you see in quite modern popular fairy tales, like the tasks that Psyche has to accomplish, which is really, really interesting to me. And I'm really excited to see how Luna McNamara brings it all together, and I'm just like so grateful that somebody has written a retelling of this myth which is set in antiquity and like draws on that ancient setting. So yeah. Then the next book inspired by Greek mythology isn't actually out yet. It comes out on the 31st of August, so not terribly long to wait, and that is Herc by Phoenicia Rogerson. It says hero, husband, father, villain, monster. He is all of these things, this is true. And this is actually a retelling or novel inspired by the figure of Heracles, or Hercules, from Greek and Roman mythology. It's been described as a feminist interpretation of Hercules' story. It's also been pointed out to me that it explores some of the queer elements of Hercules' story, and I'm really excited to see what an author does with Heracles. I'm sorry if I keep jumping back and forward between saying Heracles and Hercules here, like I'm all over the place. Heracles is the Greek name, Hercules is the Roman name. Maybe we'll just call him Herc. So I'm really interested to see what the author does with Herc's character here, because he's somebody that a lot of us probably grew up with thinking as like this very like idealized hero from Disney films, and then he was certainly like deemed a hero in antiquity, but he also did a lot of really awful things by modern standards, and he's also much more complex than I think a lot of people realise, and his involvement in Greek mythology is far more expansive than I think a lot of people realise. You know, you maybe think of the 12 Labours, but did you know he was one of the crew members of the Argo from Jason and the Argonauts? Maybe not. So I'm really excited to see what Phoenicia Rogerson does with this story. On the topic of books that were sent to me, I actually have a non-fiction book here that was sent to me by the author, which is Messalina, A Story of Empire, Slander and Adultery by Honor Cargill Martin. So this is a new non-fiction book, which is a like biography effectively of the Empress Messalina. So Messalina was the third wife of the Emperor Claudius, so part of the Julio-Claudian dynasty in the early days really of the Roman Empire. And like with a lot of Roman empresses, she gets a reputation in the ancient Roman sources as being, you know, like controlling, manipulative, sexually insatiable, and then just like a bunch of other stuff that might have been levied against someone to ruin their reputation. And it's very difficult to entirely know with the Roman sources how much of it is political propaganda and trying to tear down people's reputations, because you see similar messaging and similar imagery used for a lot of women and men of the imperial family, depending on how popular they are. But then, you know, on the other side of things, right? You give a bunch of like rich imperial men and women like endless power and money, and yeah, sometimes they do some pretty like wild things. So I am really excited to read this book because I haven't really read or studied or spent much time looking at the history of the Roman empresses since I was doing my undergraduate. I actually did a whole course on Roman empresses when I was at uni, and I have forgotten probably 2/3 of what I learned in that course, and Messalina is certainly not somebody who I remember much about in particular. I always have a much more vivid recollection of the women connected more closely to Nero, so whether it was his mother or his wives, probably because those were who I wrote my essays on, you know, that's what ends up becoming ingrained in your brain. So it'll be really nice and interesting to learn more about Messalina and just dip my toes a little bit back into Roman imperial history. Carrying on with the Roman theme, however, I do have another non-fiction book, which is Sacred Britannia, The Gods and Rituals of Roman Britain by Miranda Aldhouse Green. If you don't know, the Roman Empire occupied the British Isles for around half a century. No, that is definitely not long enough. Half a millennia was what I was trying to say, for almost half a millennia. During the time when the British Isles was predominantly otherwise occupied by different Celtic peoples, including like the Britannic, the Picts and the Gaels, and prior to like the mass influx of Anglo-Saxons. So although like in a lot of ways Romans were aggressors, there is obviously like blending of cultures through coexisting and living alongside one another for hundreds of years, which makes for very interesting kind of accounts of like semi-Roman, semi-Celtic religion and gods and goddesses, and I'm really interested to learn like a little bit more in depth, so I'm hoping this book will do that for me. Okay, let's steer back to some fiction, shall we? The next 3 books I have here I bought in Forbidden Planet in London, and the first one is The Foxglove King by Hannah Whitten. I've yet to read anything by Hannah Whitten, but I have heard nothing but fantastic things about their work, and the blurb of this one just like immediately drew me in, so I thought, hey, you're coming home with me. Let me read the blurb to you in that case as well. In this gilded gothic and romantic new epic fantasy series from New York Times best-selling author Hannah Whitten, a young woman's secret power to raise the dead plunges her into the dangerous world of the sainted king's royal court. Now, those words, gothic and romantic epic fantasy, had me. They had me. Lore has been living by her wits since she was a child, running poisons for the cartel that took her in, avoiding the attention of the law, and keeping her illicit affinity for death magic a secret. When a job goes wrong and Lore is captured by the sainted king's warrior monks, she expects death, but King August has a different plan. Entire villages on the outskirts of the country have been dying overnight, seemingly at random. Lore can either use her magic to find out what happened or face the pyre. Thrust into a lavish court where no one can be believed and even fewer can be trusted, Lore must navigate an intricate web of politics, religion and forbidden romance to solve the king's mystery. A mystery more dangerous and twisted than Lore can even imagine. That sold me, so maybe it will sell you. So I don't know what I'm trying to say. We then have She Is a Haunting, which I believe is like a YA thriller again, or YA horror book by Trang Than Tran, and it had £1 off if you can spot the sticker there. This one initially drew me in because it is a haunted house story, which I love. I love a creepy house, a creepy dwelling. I think it is a timeless theme or trope of horror literature, which I'm always here to try new variations on. But I also find it very interesting that the first sentence read that this summer Jade has one goal: to survive living a lie with her sister and their estranged dad while he fixes up a decaying colonial house in Vietnam. So not only does it have a haunted house, but there's obviously some secrecy around why she's there and why she's reunited with a family that she wasn't close to before. I don't really know what's going on there, and I like that. I like the combination of mundane, maybe not mundane, but you know, sort of like those kind of like real world issues combined with creepy haunted issues. Sounds good. And then we return to non-fiction because the last book I bought in Forbidden Planet was also non-fiction. I've been getting back into non-fiction more recently, so if that wasn't evident before, it probably is now. However, this one is not necessarily a history book, and it's called Unlikable Female Characters by Anna Bogatskaya. The subtitle of which is The Women Pop Culture Wants You to hate. And I believe this book does what it says in the tin effectively. It looks at women characters in media who are unlikable, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, you know. Their unlikability is basically a clapback at respectability politics, and the idea that women have to fit into certain conventions in order to be like heroes or heroines or protagonists or even likable. I mean, unlikable in a way is a kind of redundant, useless word to use, isn't it? Because people are flawed and messy and sometimes awful, but they can still be entertaining or endearing or even rootable for, or even you're able to root for them. So I'm really excited to see what characters this book explores. I have literally no idea who it covers or what media it covers, but I'm sure it's going to make me think a lot more deeply about those characters and generally the depiction of women in media once I've read it. I then have a book which I know for certain was on a ton of people's most anticipated releases of the year's list, as it was mine, and that is Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This is a contemporary a contemporary fiction book, a contemporary novel about a woman who steals the manuscript of her dead friend, friend probably doesn't sound like the right word, who she had worked alongside in publishing. So when her friend dies, she discovers that her friend had a manuscript for an amazing book, but she'd never shared it with anybody, and she decides she'll pass it off as her own. But not only does this incident involve plagiarism, it also involves the main character Asian catfishing, basically, because she then lets everybody believe that it's an own voices novel despite being a white woman. And it's a book that explores a lot of the issues in publishing, particularly pertaining to racism. And from everything I've heard since this book came out, it is phenomenal. All of my friends who work in publishing who have read it have just been like, yep. So yeah, I have nothing but faith in this book, and I'm sure it's going to make me incredibly angry when I read it, and it's going to be really incredibly well done, and I cannot wait. It's like very, very high up on my TBR. It's one of the next books I plan on reading. Then we have a collection of folktales. This is Tales of Polynesia, folktales from Hawaii, New Zealand, Tahiti and Samoa. And these are all collected from different authors, generally like out of print, generally out of copyright, so like older works, like classic collections of folktales from these places, and brought together in this collection with beautiful new accompanying illustrations. So for example, this is one of the illustrator's pieces. They are just gorgeous, and it's part of a series published by Chronicle Books, which explore folktales and bring together folktales from lots of different parts of the world. So there is a Celtic volume, a Nordic volume, an Indian volume, a Chinese volume, and then there's definitely a couple more that I'm just not able to recall off the top of my head, but I've been collecting them, and this is the latest to come out. So this only came out very, very recently, and I was just super excited when I saw this was going to be added to the collection, so I'm pretty sure I bought it on publication week. Really great series, really great addition to it. Cannot wait to read the stories in here that I haven't previously read, because quite a few of them I have already read, but I think it's really nice to have them brought together here in this collection, as well as with some that I haven't. Love this series. And on a similar theme, in fact, of collected stories all in one place, we have Celtic Weird, Tales of Wicked, Folklore and Dark Mythology, published by the British Library. And this is another one that's part of a series ongoing by the British Library, of which I only have two. So this is only the second book in the series I have. But I really, really enjoy that it's focused on like the creepier side of things. I think everything in this series in particular is either kind of like about straightforward ghost stories or about like horror and dark undertones in mythology and folklore. So they're all like quite dark and creepy. So for example, growing up in Scotland, you are always kind of made aware of the fact that the like folklore that people just generally pass about, or the perceptions of the fair folk and magic that people have passed down, is very dark. Like the fair folk are pretty dangerous in Scottish folklore. They're not a kind of creature to be messed with, and I think it's really interesting, like I said, to have that explored in more collections, because it was kind of always my understanding of these things as a kid growing up. So yeah, I might be rambling at this point. I don't know, I've been sitting here filming for ages, but the tales in this collection include those from Wales, Scotland, Ireland, Cornwall, Britannia and the Isle of Man. I then have what is like part history, part art book, which is Pagans, the visual culture of pagan myths, legends and rituals, by Ethan Doyle White and published by Thames and Hudson. Thames and Hudson in particular specialise in like very art heavy books. They do both children and adult books, and their adult books are maybe more traditional art books like this, and then their children's books are just some of the most beautifully illustrated, beautifully bound and put together children's books I think on the market. But yeah, so this is a look at like depictions of pagan culture throughout history in art, whether it be like literal standing stones, actual art by those deemed pagans by Christians, or whether it be, you know, pagans as depicted by Christians. But we've got like, you know, painted art form, we've got architecture, we've got tarot cards in here, we've got clothing and paintings and sculptures and a little bit of everything. And I've always been a great appreciator of what visual culture and art can teach us. And just to clarify, in case you're not familiar, pagan as a term is used very differently by lots of different people, but in its origins it was a word used by Christianity basically to delineate religions that were not Christianity. So it can actually cover a really broad range of things, not just perhaps like neo-paganism, which might be some people's like immediate frame of reference, and this book covers a lot of that, which is really cool. Oh, and I don't know if I actually mentioned, but this was sent to me by the publisher, so that was very, very kind of them. It's a new release and I'm very excited to get to it. And I'm sorry to say the next few books are also non-fiction as well. I told you I've just been all about the non-fiction recently, but the next one is Wedded Wife, A Feminist History of Marriage by Rachel E. Lennon, which sounds super interesting. Again, marriage is something I've always found very interesting and I've written a lot about in terms of ancient Greece and learned a lot about in terms of other history periods, but I would love to read more of like an analysis as a whole on the concept. And then I also just think it's really interesting to consider from a modern political feminist perspective, because like marriage doesn't necessarily have the most romantic origins despite our romanticization of it today. And I grew up in a household that did not advocate for marriage. Like my parents never married and they did not see marriage as something that fit with their ideals. But then on the flip side of things, I know personally that my partner and I have discussed getting married. So it's like an odd thing historically and in a modern context that I find very interesting to like ponder, and obviously it means something very different to different people today, but historical context is important, so I think this will be really, really interesting. I also don't know what the conclusions are. I also do not know what conclusions it's going to draw at all, but I think it will be very interesting to contemplate. So yeah, excited for that one. And then we have a book on like the good old patriarchy. This is Angela Saini's latest book, The Patriarch, How Men Came to Rule, and I am obsessed with Angela Saini. I've read her previous two non-fiction books, Inferior and Superior, and they're two of my favourite non-fiction books. I recommend them to everybody. They're fantastic, and when I saw she had a new book out, I immediately picked it up. This one is described as a bold and radical book by award-winning science journalist Angela Saini, which goes in search of the true roots of gender depression, uncovering a complex history of how male domination became embedded in societies and spread across the globe from prehistory into the present. One of the things I really appreciate about Angela Saini's work in particular is her like scientific perspective, because she brings that to the table and she's able to look at the way in which science has been misused and abused to create power structures throughout history, and I think that's a really interesting perspective, so looking forward to seeing how she applies it here. And then last but not least, I thought I would mention these because, you know, I did recently acquire them. My books. So these are my most recent books to have come out, which are Greek Myths, Gods and Goddesses, and Greek Myths, Heroes and Heroines, published by Pan Macmillan, specifically as a part of their Macmillan Collectors Library series. So Macmillan Collectors Library is a little series published by Pan Mac of classics. They have these gorgeous like gold foiled sprayed edges, really beautiful covers, all with this duck egg blue, is it? And really nice little naked hardbacks underneath. Quite a few of which I already own. I love these little books and always have done, and I remember one of the first videos I ever made when I worked at Pan Macmillan, because if you don't know, I used to work at Pan Macmillan way back in like 2016, 2017 as their creative, I actually forget what my role was called, but I made their YouTube videos basically. And one of the first videos I made was on this series, and it feels very full circle that I now have two in the series. Now naturally these are classics, so I didn't write the majority of the content in these. These are a collection of Greek myths compiled by myself, so I trolled through many old collections of Greek myths written predominantly in the 19th century to find the ones that I both felt were most entertaining but also like true to the originals, and bring them together in these collections that should be nice and accessible for you, and wrote accompanying material to go alongside them, including introductions to the concepts of the books themselves and a little bit about Greek mythology, and also like the relationship of 19th century people to Greek mythology and why they were still like rewriting them, as well as contextual introductions to the individual stories or sections in the books themselves. So I really enjoyed editing these little volumes, and I'm really excited that they're just out there in the world, and I'm so pleased with the incredible job that the design team at MCL did with them, because they're gorgeous. Well picked red figure vase paintings. So yeah, had to mention them, self-plug right there at the end, but they are books I hold. That, however, does bring me to the end of this haul. Those are all the books that I can remember acquiring in the past 3 months, or could find that I acquired in the past 3 months. A fair chunk of which I am realising is non-fiction, but hopefully you enjoyed this book haul. Hopefully you found some of the titles I talked about interesting, and if you'd like to talk about them more in the comments down below, I would love to have you and to discuss it further. I'd also love to know if you've read any of them, what you thought about them, or if you can recommend any more books to me on some of the themes I have indicated I am interested in. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone.